All right, so I think I'll kick off now. And obviously, anyone else that joins us, they'll kind of tune in as we go. So, hello, everyone. My name's James Goddard, one of the co-founders of Talent Community. Talent Community is a network of TA professionals across internal agency, embedded and RPO, looking to learn from one another. I'm joined by Ray Walker. Ray, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. Ray Walker, I have been working in the contractor sector, providing solutions for workers around the world. I'm in my 24th year of doing this now. So happen to have been around since the beginning of IR35. So it's a good subject for me to discuss at the very least. I've seen a lot of evolution within the marketplace.
Yeah, I suppose there's been a lot of changes, haven't there, over the last 20 years or so. You've got IR35 coming into the public sector, the private sector, and kind of the original legislation as well. So you've kind of been there to advise people on all the different changes that have happened. As kind of a brief background on kind of why Ray and I are speaking, we first met at an in-person event that was hosted by Worksome earlier in the year, where Ray was discussing some of the changes that were coming into effect this April in reference to IR35. And we thought it'd be good to host a free online webinar to share the information for those that couldn't attend that event. So thanks everyone for joining. Kind of as a brief run through, the call is going to be about 45 minutes in length. So Ray and I are going to be speaking for about 25, 30 minutes. And then we'll be using the last kind of 25 or 20 to 15 minutes. And we'll open the floor to anyone in the chat who has a specific IR35 question they'd like Ray to answer that they might have thought of kind of during the call or ahead of the call. For those TTC members on the call who haven't got a ticket to RecFest yet, we'll be offering a paid for RecFest ticket at random to anyone at the end of the call. So, please feel free to stay on at the end, and we'll be doing a raffle after the call and emailing you directly to let you know if you've got that kind of free ticket. So without further ado, let's get into it. So Ray, can you briefly explain IR35 for us, imagining that we don't know what it is?
Yeah, no worries. It's very complex, but I'll give you the simple part of where workers are operating through their own limited company, which is commonly known as a personal service company or a PSC. If they're engaging through one of those, and if it were not for that limited company, they would be treated as an employee, then IR35 is there to sort of catch that and make sure that the individuals are paying tax as an employee. So it's to try and level the playing field so that somebody can't use their limited company to receive the tax benefits of being self-employed when they're actually operating like an employee.
Very good summary of that. And can you explain the IR35 offset that was announced last November?
Yeah, it's a strange old name, first and foremost, because I get people saying to me and go, what's changing in IR35? And the answer is nothing. Nothing's changing with IR35. That remained the same. The offset itself is actually sort of the way HMRC can offset the different tax revenues that they've received or going to receive or charges. Very complicated. I'm going to try and simplify that.
Okay.
It used to be, before the reforms came in, the worker themselves was responsible for managing their PSC. So they were also responsible for if they were deemed inside IR35 and PAYE was applied. So that meant the same party was effectively liaising with HMRC on if there was going to be an additional tax bill. When the reforms came in, that changed. It then meant that the client is ultimately responsible for determining whether somebody's inside or outside, and then that passes down to the fee payer in the chain for if there's a misclassification case. Now, if somebody's outside, they're paid gross until such time as there's a misclassification case raised against them, which could be years down the line. The person who's paying tax to HMRC on an outside is the worker still. That remains the same. But in a misclassification case, the fee payer or the client will then be charged. So we've now got two parties brought into HMRC. And to simplify things, because it was raised as a number of issues on this, that HMRC were accused of possibly double taxation, which is illegal, effectively taxing the client for an inside case whilst receiving money from the worker on an outside case. They said, okay, HMRC has control of all of this, all of the transactions, all of the money, all what's due. They can effectively net it off against all of that themselves without involving the different parties. And that's what the offset does. It ultimately says, okay, we've received some tax revenues in the form of corporation tax, dividend income tax, maybe some levels of social security from the worker, and then it's been transferred to being an inside IR35 case. Well, the bill that we're going to put against the client at that point, or the fee payer, whoever it may be, we're going to take that bit that's been paid off. That's in a nutshell, and that still took me a minute or two to say, is what it's actually saying. But effectively moving money from your left pocket to the right pocket, as opposed to paying it back and getting different parties to come in and claim.
Would you say then that they are trying to calculate it so the worker and the employer is sharing the risk equally from that calculation?
Not necessarily the risk, because the risk of misclassification sits with the client and the fee payer. That's where that sits. What it's trying to do, when they brought the reforms in, it put a great deal of nervousness into the market. The clients, quite naturally being corporate entities, don't want to carry risk. They're afraid of risk at all times. So they found that there was a lot of companies then started to then shut down the use of PSCs and to try to remove themselves from any IR35 risks. HMRC, by bringing this in, have said ultimately the chance of a misclassification risk remains the same, but the charges associated to misclassification have now greatly reduced.
Okay.
To put that into absolute context, a sort of a rough calculation would say that the bill of a misclassification is reduced by up to 70%, which is quite a sizable part. If you were working with somebody and you had a figure in your head and said, hey, I think somebody's outside, and if they were deemed as inside, that was going to be £10,000, for instance, that charge is now £3,000. Now, on a case by case, that's not amazing, it's good. But if that's done over, you've got, say, 100 workers, that risk of misclassification has now been quantified into a position where you might say, do you know what? I'll start working with PSCs because I'm comfortable that the cost associated to misclassification risk has come down.
Yeah, I suppose the initial risk and cost was so high, it did frighten a lot of customers when it came into the market, especially within the private sector. You had businesses just doing blanket determinations on IR35 without doing assessments.
I think there's still a case of that happening as well. You got two levels. The first one where companies just banned working with PSCs because a blanket determination in itself is still illegal. That's actually a failure of reasonable care. So by banning PSCs, they couldn't then be against and sort of like say that they're not working with the rules in the right way. The ones that did continue to work with PSCs but put a ban out straight away and said, you know, everybody's going to be inside. As I say, that's actually that there's HMRC have put their guidance notes out to say that that's a failure of reasonable care. It could be classed as illegal. So that's the worst one they can possibly do, but it still happened. Their attempt here is to try and say, look, we want the world to loosen up a little bit and work with PSC contractors because we can see the benefit that they bring to business, but we're trying to take away some of that perceived pain.
Do you think that's an attempt by HMRC to be fairer to PSC contractors?
I do. I don't think necessarily HMRC drove it because I don't think they're they're ultimately a target-driven organisation. Their job is to bring in as much money as it can for the exchequer. But I think from a political environment, that was what sort of drove it to say, right, what can you do to be able to make this appear fairer, if I can say the word.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. What do you think existing IR35 tools and solutions will do? And do you think they'll stand up against the new changes?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the change to IR35 hasn't actually impacted anything. There's no change to IR35. So if you're using any tools before April this year, those tools will be just as effective as they were prior to that. The real difference here is likely to be sitting in the mentality of the actual end user of the workers, in saying, hey, you know, and opening their mind to working with PSCs again. So anybody, whatever tools you might have, whatever systems and services you've got, is now saying that the legal teams at the clients might open up and say, okay, we're willing to look at those now. We're willing to understand. As long as you've got a robust process, a robust system for determining whether somebody's inside or outside, that should now mean that, okay, you know, there is risk within business all of the time, but it's now making that risk into a level where they're saying, okay, financially it's worth engaging with those individuals. There's the other side of that coin, where there's definitely been an uplift of day rates for people who are operating as inside IR35, and you see people advertise themselves as with two rates, one as inside, one as outside. Now that's an absolute direct cost to that approach. So if you've got the risk which isn't realised until necessarily the issue happens, the risk has come down as a value, but the direct actual cost of working with someone inside has definitely gone up. You could see how, again, procurement leads may well go, this is something we can actually get into now.
Yeah, I always thought it was an interesting one as a contract recruiter to see people advertising two rates, one outside and one inside.
Yeah.
So it makes complete sense to the contractor. You know, I absolutely understand that they'd want to offset some of the tax that they would be having to pay in their pay slip each month via umbrella, and try and accrue it via a higher rate. But it did seem to kind of be a bit ironic when you look at the policy, because I suppose if we're kind of taking it at its face, you should be doing the determination at the end of the process, once you've got the contract and all the bits in place in regards to hiring the interim worker, not at the start when you begin to recruit. But
yeah, I totally agree. I think that kind of led possibly HMRC to this point of understanding, or certainly the politics behind it, to making these changes, because it was leading to sort of actions that they weren't necessarily expecting or wanting. Prior to these changes, people would operate, if they had to go through an umbrella model, they would operate on the same rate. They didn't go and challenge it. But then it started to then highlight how things would be, and then they started to then adjust and change from there. So yeah, I think that's a big factor behind the reforms that they brought in, not the reforms, the offset that they brought in April.
Yeah. I've spoken to a few people that thought that HMRC probably weren't too worried about the rate increases on inside contracts, just because they accrue more in income tax and NI. But I suppose you're looking at it both sides, aren't you?
I agree with you. You know, it sounds like we're being cynical, but I don't think it is. As I say, they are a target-driven organisation. So, of course, the more people that go inside, the more money they get from it. And if those people are actually increasing their rates, they're getting more and more revenue. Ultimately, the challenge, the counter to that is, if you make it too punishing, do you lose talent from the UK? And there's definitely been a case of that happening, where people have either simply retired because they've said it is too challenging, or they've gone overseas. And the world being what it is nowadays, it's easy to operate for an overseas client without actually leaving the comfort of your own home. So, you know, that's, I think, probably the biggest part, is that talent drain that it may well have pushed. And that's what I think they're trying to reverse with it.
Actually, an interesting question. If I was a UK limited company contractor and I was working with a German company, would I need to worry about IR35 classifications?
In the simplest form, the answer is no. There is a part in there which talks about group companies. So if you was working for that German company, it was in a corporate group and it had a UK entity, there's a potential that it's going to be that IR35 is involved. That's yet to be proven in case law, so it's still to be understood in absolute detail. But it's expected that if that UK entity has nothing to do with the contract, has no benefits to gain or what have you, then the IR35 won't apply. It'd be as if that UK entity didn't exist. But if it is influenced and involved in that project, then IR35 would apply, and that UK entity would have to make a determination.
Okay, that's interesting. So effectively, if it was a company with no base in the UK at all, probably be less of an issue. But if that was a group business, you know, a big PLC,
Yeah.
it could be accused of, I suppose, trying to get around the UK IR35 rules by hiring through a subsidiary based abroad.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be, that's one of the points that over the years, as we start to see this flush out and we start to see how the rules are actually applied, that'll be one of the ones that'll be really interesting to sort of understand. From my perspective, I'm always talking to our clients and saying, look, as long as that UK entity is not involved, and you know, truly they have to be not involved, then that's fine. Carry on operating, and you're outside the scope of IR35. You don't have to apply it.
Yeah. What about small companies? How are they affected? So I know there's an SME kind of provision that means that smaller businesses don't necessarily need to worry so much about classifying contractors as inside or outside. But do you think that holds water? Do you think that might be something that HMRC look at, or people are getting in trouble over?
I think it definitely holds water. It's written in the legislation, so that if you're in the small size company, what that means. So I'll get slightly technical. The IR35 reforms, or off-payroll reforms, as they're officially known now, come under Chapter 10 in the Income Tax, Earnings and Pensions Act. The original IR35 came under Chapter 8. So what happens is if you're working for a small company, Chapter 8 applies rather than Chapter 10. And that means that then the worker themselves is responsible for determining whether they're inside or outside, which also means that the worker is responsible for a misclassification case. If the small company transitions and becomes a medium-sized company, they have to do that for 2 full years. Once they've done that, then IR35 reforms or Chapter 10 then applies, and they're then responsible for it. So there's a good level of leeway if you do sit into the small size category. I cannot see HMRC changing that, because that would mean, to all intents and purposes, the person who's running a PSC, if they started to work with another PSC, so a substitute, for instance, they'd have to self-determine that. So, you know, it becomes a bit of a vortex that I don't think anybody can go down and manage. So I cannot see them bringing in the small companies into that.
And I suppose they're after the tax implications from larger, you know, enterprise PLCs instead of people having, you know, 2-3 contractors versus.
Yeah, I think exactly that. The biggest benefit of the reforms is any legal case will be done with multiple workers, not just single cases. And the problem that HMRC have always suffered, again, prior to the reforms, is they take a case to tribunal, they may win that case. They struggled to win it. They did. The yields they were getting were in the tens of thousands, and they were spending more than that in legal fees to be able to sit back and get that. Whereas if they take that in on a sort of like a case against the corporate, and they've got dozens to hundreds of workers, the tax yield that they're going to get from that is going to be more than worth the expense it takes to chase it.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you seeing it? Are you seeing more businesses look at outside IR35 classifications when releasing new freelance and contract roles, or has much changed since April?
Yeah, as from my view at the moment, no, it hasn't. It doesn't mean it's not changing in different places. I've certainly had people speak to me about, oh, will we see changes? How do we expect this to play out? But I haven't seen anything in the market actually happen, and we're still quite close to it. You know, we're only a month down the line from that. But I just know that sort of like the ones who really drove this policy, which were sort of like the big tier 1 financial institutions, quite publicly defended themselves and said, no, we're not going to do this. They'll be probably the last ones that will change and have to change. But the companies that are slightly smaller than them, say tier 2, tier 3s, they're really fighting for talent, and they have to find the right sort of balance on that. So I can see them making the change. And as that happens, I think then the tier 1s will go, hang on a minute, we're losing our talent down to the people who we can't lose it to. So I'm not seeing anything at the moment, but I'm not too surprised. I'd love to be a year down the track and sort of looking backwards. I would expect to see changes there.
Yeah, I remember when it first came into the private sector, and that it happened in a similar manner. So you had the big tier 1 financial institutions go through what they'd argue not blanket determinations, but just come policy changes where they didn't work with PSCs. And then you had smaller businesses, some that were not affected by R35 due to what we've just discussed, but then looking at that mid-sized layer, and they had to be maybe slightly more creative around how they attracted talent, how they engaged with talent, and they were the ones that were maybe doing the interesting classifications, trying to adopt SOW tactics. And actually, there was a bit of a boom period for consultancies. So you had kind of maybe 200, 300, 400 person consultancies. I've worked within technology recruitment, and they did very well off it because they were able to, adapt and adopt kind of SOW. They could find talent that maybe those big institutions couldn't find because they were able to adopt and engage with our outside R35 contractors. So it was a really interesting time for the market, and hopefully, as you say, the change trickles through and a bit of education happens, and maybe people start seeing businesses being a bit looser and a bit more creative in how they engage with freelance talent. That will start trickling through and changing decisions.
I think you've got, I don't disagree. I think when it comes down to the money side of things, that's often the big driver on stuff. And when people start sitting back and going, do you know what, we're having to pay more for the same talent, but we could do that a cheaper way if we can work with them outside of IR35. If we can simplify the supply chain, again, it becomes cheaper. All of those things. That doesn't change from the fact that people have got to, if you're going to benefit from an outside IR35, you've got to have a business structure to be able to work in the correct way. And that often has sort of like big changes required for that as well, because they want to work with their talent in a way that means that they got to control them and hold on to them and what have you. And you go, well, that's employed. So you can't just necessarily go, great, we'll work with PSCs, but we're going to carry on working like their employees, because you don't get anywhere. So there's a couple of big changes that need to happen for people who are not working with PSCs or sort of restricting their use to that at the moment. They've got to take on that mental challenge of going, right, we're going to open up our doors again. And then B, they've got to actually change some of their business practices to be able to work in the correct way.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen HMRC doing more audits and follow-ups around IR35? Do you think they're being more active? Because I know there was a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, where they didn't really do very much.
So yes is the simple answer on that. We've seen quite a lot of activity. And they're sort of coming in whichever way they can. What we're seeing at the moment is fact-finding activity is probably the best thing to say. We've certainly heard of some actual formal inquiries that have been raised, but the fact-finding have come in a number of different ways, and they're effectively trying to understand. They can speak to the clients now, which is something they couldn't do, and they're trying to understand and go, right, are you working, what sort of off-payroll talent are you working with, to what scale, to what manner, and then taking that away. So we're then having to guess the next bit, which is we expect that they're looking for the easy kill, to be honest. People who haven't got good process, they're working with a good deal of off-payroll workers, and they can go in and win that case quite easily, because that will set the precedent. Once they've got a precedent down, then everybody knows what they need to follow. So there's definite activity from HMRC, and even during the time when there seemed no activity, they were actually sending out inquiry letters and what have you. But again, this only ever becomes public knowledge once somebody says, no, I'm not going to pay that, I'm going to take it to tribunal. Outside of that, it just becomes commercial conversations between HMRC and the company itself. So that's all happening. It's not something that sort of people can say, oh, do you know what, this reform stuff, it was a big hoo-ha and nothing happened with it. No, it's definitely happening. It's definitely there. And I'd expect maybe even this year, but certainly in the first half of next year, I think you'll start to see the public cases of where somebody's effectively fighting it and taking it to tribunal.
Okay. Yeah, well, that'd be really interesting to see, because as you say,
yeah,
not really been out there, but those conversations might have been had behind closed doors, and you've effectively got arrangements and commercial conversations around how not to end up in the kind of the public eye. I've seen a few questions come through the chat. 2 of them look quite interesting, actually. Yes, Ahmed asked, how should companies negotiate rates especially in a smaller company, the financial burden and employer rights and benefits kill the amount to be offered. I'm just curious, how should we attract talent with this problem?
Yeah, I mean, what a big question.
Yes.
How to negotiate rates. I mean, I'd always say probably the best way to do that is to try and open up the talent pool as much as you possibly can, because the wider the talent pool, the more people you've got to choose from, and hopefully you can use that as creating that competitive line. If you're going to bring IR35 into this, then it's a case of saying, well, can I work with people who are outside IR35, which goes back to that bit of me saying your business has to be structured in such a way that you can. So that simply means you're not going to control the individual. You're not going to sit back and you're going to allow them to effectively bring in a substitution of their choosing. They're going to perform the work wherever they want to perform it, however they want to perform it, and whenever they perform it. You give them effectively an output, or you require an output, and they then tell you how they're going to get to the output phase. Of course, there's got to be typical interactions in a project, and there's going to be codependencies. Yes, that's expected, and that's allowed as for that to be managed by yourself, the client. But the more you can release things to show that you're only having to bring those into those conversations because of the codependencies, but they go away and do that, the more you've got that outside case. And in that instance, then those employer costs disappear because you're paying the worker gross. But it is a case of IR35 as a classification is a matter of fact. It isn't a matter of opinion. So somebody either is outside IR35 or they're not. But it's about how you structure your business. That's the best you can do to benefit from the way this is working at the moment.
Yeah, from the way the setup's done. I'd say as well, from experience of talking to businesses that have been engaging with contract talent, that I think consistency is really key. So if you've got a base of contractors that are all paid X and there's another contractor who's recently joined the program being paid Y, that's only going to cause issues. And you either need to adjust the pay rate across all the contractors or push back harder on the new contractor that you're joining.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a little bit of more fluid conversation around negotiating with a contractor than negotiating with a permanent employee, because you won't have fixed salary bandings that you need to harmonize within the organization. I suppose that might be one of the really good things about hiring a freelancer or interim talent. You can pay that bit extra, but not have to worry about hiring someone that then kind of sits in the organization and disrupts all the salary bandings that you've put together, especially if you're a really big organization. But it's a really interesting question. It kind of impacts contractors, it impacts end users, people hiring contractors, impacts intermediaries like Worksome, like recruitment agencies. Cool. I can see another question that's come through from Matthew Childs. We've all seen the contract market and the need for interims pick up. I would agree with that. I think we look at some of the rec figures that have been published recently, and we work with a business called Raise that operates within the contract space. There's been a 20 to 25% increase in interims, specifically over October to January last year. This is great. A lot of the time it's an interim till they find the permanent headcount. Do we assume then that all roles hired like this will be deemed inside, or as long as we follow guidelines, those could be outside? Keen to understand how we can manage this as a business, which is a great question as well, because a lot of contract hiring is done to backfill roles before they find permanent roles.
Yeah, if you're backfilling and therefore you've got people in your business doing the same role as this individual, you're very much looking at that being an inside case. I wouldn't assume anything. So they should be judged on their merits in their own way. But yeah, if you are sort of like backfilling, then it does look, because you're going to want to control them. So again, if you look at an outside, they should be brought in for a specific reason, given a specific role and a specialist sort of level. And the converse to that is, if that specific reason or specific role disappears, then you need to get rid of them straight away. They shouldn't be left there to just sort of like, still feed off off of your business whilst they're not needed. But if you've got somebody and you say, well, actually, I need them, they're going to be Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and they're going to be doing this task, and then we're going to be working with multiple clients, then you can see you've lost that. They're not specific anymore. You've lost that level of control, or rather, you've got that control, but the worker's lost that level of control. So, and when you're backfilling for a permanent member of staff, more often than not, you are going, right, I need you Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I need you to work on all of these clients and these different projects. That's what makes it more challenging. But if you can bring somebody in, and it may be a cover for a person, but it's for, like I say, a specific purpose, then you can get them as outside.
Yeah, so I suppose what you're saying is the purpose could be to cover the tasks that a permanent employee was doing or will be doing. But if the engagement is done in such a way that you can write the contract and the person is performing tasks that would sit as outside of IR35, you could still probably argue that you could have an outside of IR35 contractor doing that role, just as long as it was positioned and the contract was written in the right way.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. What's written in the contract is not even half the story. It's definitely required, but it's how you actually engage with the worker as well. So if you sit back and say, we're going to bring you in and you're going to work on task A and only task A, but then in practice you get them doing task B and C at the same time, but you haven't got that in the contract. The fact that it's not in the contract is irrelevant. It will be known, or certainly will be investigated and found out that you've got them onto B and C, and therefore you treated them and ran them as an employee. So yeah, it goes down to that same thing, structuring your business in the right way. If you had a permanent employee, they've left you, but you've got, say, a client and they were running on a specific project with that client, and you've got to fill that gap, you can bring in a special talent for it to go and fill in that gap with that client, whilst you're looking for a permanent member who's going to work with that client and 4 or 5 other clients, or however you're working with your employees. That's the way I can see it can work in, as being outside. But likely it will be inside, but don't assume. Definitely go through the classification thing and really understand the way they're working.
Yeah, definitely. Matthew, did you feel like that answered your question? So you might take him a little time to respond to that.
A little while to type, yeah.
Really quickly typing. So I suppose if I was in that position and I wanted a little bit more security in going through that determination, what would you suggest I did from your perspective as an expert in the market?
As I say, from a business, you've got to sit back and accept that you're going to work with them as an independent contractor, not like an employee. And the best way I always use is your plumber scenario. If you go and invite a plumber around your house to do some work on your house, they'll sit back and they'll quote, they'll tell you what it's going to do. More often than not, they'll turn up late on the first day, but you can't do anything about it. They might sit back and start doing the work, and then suddenly their mate Dave comes around and finishes off the work. And then if they break it, you're going to expect them to repair it. If they finish the job early, you're going to say, great, there you go, they finished the job early, but you're still paying the fee that they've sort of like decided upon. All of those things is how you should operate with someone in an outside IR35 role. Again, doesn't matter who's doing the task, it doesn't matter what time they turn up, it doesn't matter how they do it. You're looking at the output being, go back to your plumber scenario, I want my new bathroom fitted. Has the bathroom been fitted to the standard that you want it to be? Yes. Pay the guy's bill. Did he do it quicker? Did he take typically a bit longer? The answer is all yes to that, but that's up to him. That's the way to sort of like really position your business. If you can't, and I totally understand, people can't necessarily operate that way in certain roles. They won't allow themselves to operate that way. I've seen people where they go, the person I'm working with is such a specialist talent, I can't allow them to work with my competitors at this stage because they might take some of that information and pass it along. Totally understand, makes perfect sense, but they need to be an employee of yours at that point, or subject to employment taxes at that point because of the control factor you're putting on them.
If I were to utilize one of the kind of indemnity products out there, so say for example, there's a bunch of insurers that are really good, right? They operate in the recruitment space. What do you feel about those? Do you think they're a good defense against IR35 classifications? Or
I do. Work some ourselves actually use one. We use the Kingsbridge product, and the reason why we use that is again to create a bit of support behind our opinions and how we actually get to our conclusions. They're fantastic, but like any insurance, there'll always be that caveat of you've got to be doing things in the right way for the right reasons for the insurance to cover you. If you're not doing things in the right way, so you go and say, I'm going to hire someone to do project A, and they do A, B, and C, straight away they'll go, right, well, you fall foul of your conditions, we're not going to cover you. So they're good to have, because so the policy that we've got means that if there's a misclassification claim from HMRC, they put a legal defence fee in place, quite a sizable legal defence fee for every single worker, and they handle that for us. So they go and speak to HMRC, they go and bring in all of their special legal talent on that, and hopefully kill it off before anything really goes anywhere. If it does go to tribunal, then and if the case actually loses, even though we've come up and done everything correct, and our opinion we still said outside, but judge says no, we definitely agree with HMRC, they should be inside, they pay out the tax, fines and penalties on that as well. So it's a wonderful policy in that instance, that it gives us the assurance that we can actually go out and work with people who are outside with this sort of like parachute there to protect us. However, what they've done with that is they've had to go through and do good due diligence on our system. They've sat and looked at it and said, yeah, we're pretty comfortable that the way you're operating, the structure you put in place, means that the outputs are sensible opinions. And that's the thing. It's an opinion. We say they're going to be outside. Somebody else might change that. And therefore, if there's going to be any sort of cases going wrong, they're going to be in the minority, not the majority. And that's the thing. If you have to rely on insurance to be able to do things correctly, then you've got it wrong. The insurance is just there to catch the mistakes of when you actually something does become a mistake.
Yeah, so it's kind of like an emergency.
Yeah,
as you said, parachute or a seatbelt. It's not like the first line of defense. The first line of defense is doing the tests properly. We partner with a business called Kudos that sound like they operate really similar way, and they're a TTC partner, so definitely suggest people check them out.
100%. Yeah, there's lots of them out there. I've got nothing bad to say about any of them. I think they're great. The crux of it being you've got to make sure you structure your business the right way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of metaphor. I've not heard it used like that, but it makes a lot of sense. There are two other questions that have come through that look really interesting, actually. So, Chloe Allport, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly there, Chloe. Very sorry if I'm not. When you say blanket inside is illegal because it's a failure of reasonable care, what are the real life consequences of clients doing this? Would be good to use as an example when speaking to managers, which is a great question. So imagining Chloe might be working in a TA team within a business that maybe does have a blanket determination. What can TAs say and point to that can advise managers on maybe taking a different course of action against kind of blanket determinations?
So it's a lovely question. I'll get a little bit technical with it to begin with, and then sort of like provide the answer. So ultimately, the party who is responsible for any misclassification cases or the taxes paid on an inside IR35 case is the fee payer. The fee payer starts with the client, and the client passes down that responsibility of the fee payer down the chain once it actually fulfills its legal obligations. A failure of reasonable care at the client means that they can't pass down the fee payer's role to anybody down the chain, because that's the part that the client is probably really the most accountable for. Reasonable care comes in a number of different ways, and HMRC have provided lots of guidance on their employment model stuff that you can easily go and look at. And what you've got there, the blanket part, which they specifically talk about in their handbooks, if you're doing that failure of reasonable care then means that the client is the fee payer. They therefore that hold the PAYE liabilities, even if somebody else has already paid the PAYE liabilities further down the train. And I don't believe that failure of reasonable care comes into the offset mechanism. So that means that you'd have to pay whatever the fees are going to be at that point. And then the other party further down the chain can go and claim them back from HMRC. But it means you're getting a big bill sent through to you. And because you failed reasonable care, they don't have to then fight to try and work out whether somebody's inside, outside, or what have you. They can literally go and say, well, you're hit with everything because you failed reasonable care. Now, in this instance, they were all inside because of the blanket approach. Right. So, they're not going to fight. It's not a misclassification case, but they then say, Mr. Client, you are now charged with the entire bill for PAYE and ICs imposed against every worker that you've actually got running through you who was in the off payroll situation. So that's the real life scenario that'll be put against them. Why are they doing it? Because again, that negative press against people doing blanket approaches, they're specifically legislated against it, and they're trying to make sure that clients are not taking that approach. And so they want to make it as painful as it can be and say, look, give everybody a fair crack at the whip. Do a test, see whether they're inside or outside. If they're inside, fine. If they're outside, again, fine, assuming everything sort of works in the right way. But if you actually stifle the entrepreneurial business here, we're going to try and crack down on that and stop it from happening. That's
really interesting. So I've actually not come across a case like that before. I can absolutely imagine it happening.
Yeah.
It's ironic that people look at blanket determinations as a way to offset risk when actually there's risks involved in doing those kind of blanket determinations as well.
Yeah, agreed. And as I say, it came from that. And it isn't that difficult. If anybody wants to find it, they can go onto Google and HMRC blanket determinations or IR35, that sort of thing, and you'll come up from HMRC, and they've got a specific page with guidance on it, and that's telling you, because they're very good, HMRC. You know, they can have their flaws, definitely, but the information they've provided around IR35 and the off payroll reforms, they've provided lots of it. So they're really telling you what they're looking for and how they're going to judge this. Wrong word, because they don't judge it. They have their opinion. It's literally the judges who sit back and do that.
Cool. So we had another question through from Bobby Banjari. This question could be for another session, but how can companies make better use of the CES tool? It's definitely a question for this session. A challenge is to see with the industry is that there is a lack of understanding of the CES tool that leads to blanket decisions being made. I can testify that that's definitely something I've seen as well. So you'll have someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience doing classifications, or it's their first time using the CES tool. And you know, as you were just saying, better safe than sorry, and they'll use it and they'll fall on an inside determination.
I think the biggest problem with CES, and there's a lot of that really could be held on a big conversation, the issues with CES, right? But the biggest problem is it relies it relies on the user having an understanding of IR35, which is a real complex piece of legislation that some would argue even HMRC get wrong on quite a regular basis. And I think justifiably would argue that. So the people who are trying to sort of police it themselves can't necessarily understand it. And then you get a user go back and say, okay, I'm going to use CES and I'll can trust on that. I think the best way of putting that into context, the public sector reforms happened 4 years before the private sector. The public sector has been fined more than £350 million for misclassification cases. And almost all of those are due to the mismanagement of CES. Now, people won't fight that because one public sector organisation doesn't fight the other. They just, you know, it's not their money at the end of the day, it stays in the same pot. But it shows you that if you haven't got the right education and you haven't got the right people using CES, it's absolutely a good chance that you can get it wrong. And you won't even know you got it wrong. You think you got it right, you think you're okay, you think you're doing the right thing. But that's what CES relies on. The person using it understands and knows what they're being asked.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? That CES is often seen as the gold standard by people because it's the HMRC's own calculator and it's on a Gov website and you feel secure using it. But actually, the kind of, if you read the small print, it doesn't defend you anything. It's not even worth the paper it's written on if you don't know the contents of the contract or what the contract is doing in an IR35 case store at the end of the day.
Exactly that. And you just put on another point. There's lots of points in there that you might be very educated, but you don't necessarily know the answer to them because you're not aware of those. If you're going to do it properly, you have to go back and do those investigations, find the answers and then do it. Often there's a time pressure put against all of these things where you're having to sort back and go, well, you know, you've got somebody, the resource manager is going, I need somebody on site by tomorrow. I need you to do this determination or what have you. And you're going, okay, but can we just go back and look at this certain clause and this check? And it's not necessarily practical, but you have to find ways of working with it. But it says, if you haven't got the knowledge then you're definitely setting yourself up for being taken down at a later stage.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think we've kind of got to the end of our session, and I hope everyone really enjoyed that. I feel like I've learned, a whole bunch about IR35, and I've been doing contract recruitment for over 10 years, so it shows that there's lots to it. It's kind of multi-layered, and you can kind of keep reading into it and picking up more. So yeah, thank you, George. Thank you very much, Matthew. So basically, there is an offer that Works are putting out at the end of this call, which is a short kind of exploratory chat with Ray and the team at Worksome around IR35 assessments. It's an offer open to businesses that are employing contractors, just to be specific in terms of what the offer's for. And hopefully from this call, you think you'd also have something to kind of pick up and maybe learn from talking to the team at Worksome and Ray. So thanks very much for your time, Ray. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to share the link in the chat below. And you have a great day.
Cheers, everyone.
All right. Cheers.